Olá, hoje o Jornal da Câmara recebe o escritor paquistanês Tariq Ali, escritor de diversos livros sobre política e história mundial. Tariq Ali é um dos principais críticos da política externa norte-americana e do chamado imperialismo ocidental. Aqui na Câmara Municipal, o escritor falou sobre seu novo livro, o Duelo, o Paquistão na Rota de Voo do Poder Americano. É um dos seus livros. Ele também escreve romances e ficções. Na palestra aqui na Câmara Municipal, ele também relacionou as revoltas de 1968, revoltas por muitas vezes estudantis, com os atuais movimentos contra a atual situação do capitalismo. Welcome, Tariq, to our studio.
Very glad to be here.
Thank you. I'd like to start our conversation by asking you about utopia. In one of your recent articles, you said that the movements like Occupy Wall Street were actually keeping alive a certain utopia about socialism. Do you think in times of worldwide crisis, is that the way to solution, keeping utopia alive?
Well, when I talked about utopia, I was quoting the great English or Irish writer Oscar Wilde, who once said that a map of the world in which utopia has disappeared is a world not worth living in. And I think he was right. And I think for 25 years now, we have had our politicians and the global media networks telling us no alternative is possible. And then you have a crash of the Wall Street system in 2008. The system doesn't function, and they still keep saying that. So that, you know, as we're talking in Greece and in Italy, democratic governments don't exist, bankers are running the country. Democracy itself is now under attack by capitalism. So we have to think differently. And I think that some form of socialism, totally democratic, which much more democratic than anything that exists today, which can build a life for its people, which lifts them, gives them dignity, and which challenges the pollution and the ecological dangers to the planet. The combination of these things is very important today.
Yeah, you have actually criticized everyone who said that democracy was impossible in the Arab world. And now we have seen, I don't know if we can call it movements, but the Arab Spring actually happened. What do you think are the outcomes of it in terms of democracy, of actual democracy?
The first point to make is that after 9/11, all those who were backing the United States critically were quite used to talking rubbish of the sort that the Arabs are genetically incapable of democracy because Islam is against democracy, all this nonsense. Well, the best reply to that has been the Arab Spring, where people all over the world can see that the Arabs are like anyone else. They don't like being ruled by despots, and they have sacrificed lives, given up the fear of death in order to topple the despotic regime.
But do you think it will stay steady, a steady movement?
This is a difficult question. We don't know is the honest answer. But I think the fact that in Egypt and Tunisia they toppled the movements, empowered the ordinary people. And this sense of self-empowerment gives them a courage and a political consciousness that didn't exist before for 30 years. So I think that will mean that they will not take easily attempts by the Egyptian military with the United States to re-establish control as they did before.
When we talk about democracy, we should remember that many of your books were banned in Pakistan. And also, The Duel is your third book on Pakistan. What I want to ask you is, were there any outcomes from your book now? And how does that relate to your novels? Because you're actually launching to The Night of the Golden Butterfly, which completes a sequel of many books towards the history of the region. Are they treated the same way, your novels and your other books?
No, none of my books are banned now. There was a bit of a problem with The Duel, but it was sorted out in 48 hours. And the book is sold in Pakistan. And my novels are not about the region. The last novel, Night of the Golden Butterfly,
Exactly.
is about the region. But the first 4 novels of the Islam Quintet are about the clash between Islamic civilization and Western Christendom, basically in Europe. These are stories of Spain in Europe, of Sicily in Europe when Islam was a major religion, which many people don't even know about. And those books have never been banned anywhere. They are distributed, translated, published all over the world, including Pakistan and including the Arab world.
That's great. But you are not one to take part on the clash of civilizations theory.
No, I wrote a whole book replying to that, which was published in Brazil, The Clash of Fundamentalisms, showing that American imperialism was a huge fundamentalism. So was extremist religious fundamentalism, but the Americans were much stronger. And I predicted that this was a problem they would deal with very quickly. And that was true. But I also in that book wanted to give a picture of what the Arab world was really like. And many of the things I said have come true now. I quoted a great Syrian poet, Nizar Kabani, who wrote in '67, after the big defeat of Arab nationalism, he asked the Arab children, the young people, forget us. We are a nation of crooks and jugglers. We are faded. We are stale. And then his last words were, Arab children, corn heirs of the future, you are the ones that will avenge defeat. And I was thinking of Nizar Kabani as I was watching the crowds in Tunis and Egypt. So good things are happening.
Great. I'd like to quote you. You said on the duel, it's not the mystical ideology of Pakistan or even religion that guarantees its survival, but 2 other factors, its nuclear capacity and the support it receives from Washington. You are very critical about the relationship between the Pakistan Army, Pakistan government and the U.S. Army and government. Did anything changed after Osama bin Laden's death? Did the treatment from the U.S. towards Pakistan, do you think it changed?
Well, I think the United States was so blatant in their violation of Pakistan's sovereignty when they went in and executed bin Laden.
Yeah.
Didn't capture him and bring him to trial, but executed him. And without informing the Pakistani military. So the whole country, even though the overwhelming majority of Pakistanis do not support bin Laden, they felt that that was a disgrace and a shame. And you know, the day after, many rickshaw drivers and taxi drivers were carrying little slogans on their taxis saying, shh, don't blow your horns today because our army is sleeping.
Wow.
That is very revealing. And
Yes.
within the army, that created a huge divide because young officers and soldiers attacked the generals and said, why did you let this happen? So the United States is really provoking that military.
Well, another thing you say about Pakistan is that it is a country tainted by corrupted bureaucrats, army officers and politicians, by governments rotten to the core. I think that somehow resembles a lot the situation we have in Brazil. Perhaps not with the same background, but with the same corruption. Do you think corruption is a common disease for all developing countries?
Not just for developing countries. It is a huge disease in the United States, where you have institutionalized corruption through the lobby system. You have had huge scandals in France, where big politicians from all the parties have been caught in corrupt acts. Pakistan is a special case because, you know, absolutely nothing is done for the ordinary people of that country. So it appears much, much worse that you have an elite and a president who is making money, looting the country's treasury, taking bribes non-stop, building up his bribe while the country suffers. And as far as Brazil is concerned, Pakistan and Brazil, the political elites can learn a lot from each other in how to take corruption to the next level now, because it's very corrupt here, the system. I have talked about it before. I mean, cabinet ministers or government ministers having to resign because of corruption, because of rackets in which they were engaged. I mean, you have a politician or a former politician like Pelosi who was caught twice, brought back twice. It's outrageous. Yeah. And the fact that people don't speak up about it, ordinary people, doesn't mean that they're not angry. It would be a big mistake to think that people like this sort of thing. They don't. And the PT doesn't appear to learn the lessons from this, which is a disaster.
Do you think this crisis related to corruption has anything to do to the lower level or something like a mediocre status of the parliaments around the world? Because I don't know, here in Brazil we can statistically see an increasing lower level of our politicians. Is it like that around the world?
I think increasingly the quality of politicians being elected to parliaments goes down and down and down. And most politicians in different parts of the world who get elected have one idea in their mind: to make money, how to make money. And politics is run, this is why I've defined this political class as the extreme center. Whether they're center left or center right, they behave in exactly the same way. And I call them the extreme center. They are corrupt, they make money, they don't challenge corporate power, and they cave into the United States or the banks or whoever. They have no vision at all. And that is frightening because it runs the risk of reducing democracy to an empty shell, like a walnut without anything in it, moving from one side to the other.
So what do you think would be a solution, a long-term solution to that?
A long-term solution has to be the emergence of political parties, political movements, and politicians who challenge all this and who make a fight and who link this to transforming the country in which they live. I mean, take Brazil on one issue, which is bad also in Pakistan, which is why it's in my mind. Education. Public education in Pakistan is probably the worst in the world. In Brazil, it's not the worst in the world, but it's neglected.
It's getting there.
It is very neglected. Yeah. So you give a lot of money to public universities, which is good because the universities in Brazil are good. Okay. But if you don't provide money to educate poor kids, how will they ever get to those universities that you're funding? So it's funding the top of the pyramid and leaving everything below as it was. This is very dangerous and actually will stop the development of Brazil, in my opinion.
I'm being told that, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But before we finish, I'd like to go on a little polemic question. Many of your books try to perhaps lower the gap between the Occidental and the Oriental discourses. I don't know if you can call it that. But how do you think the Western people can be less prejudiced towards the Orient?
Well, I think the Arab uprisings was an important learning curve for Western audiences who had accepted all the propaganda that the Arabs didn't want democracy. That was a huge triumph, and people said, oh, so they're not so different from us after all. But ultimately, it will have to be the changes that are happening in the world that will educate people. Since 9/11, more books have been written about Islam than were ever written for the last 2,000 years. More after 9, and most of them are rubbish. And that can only be challenged by the peoples in the Arab world themselves and citizens in the Western world saying we cannot accept this anymore.
Right. Tariq, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us here in this studio. Thank you for your visit.
Great pleasure. Always good to be in Porto Alegre.
All right. E obrigada a você também. O Jornal da Câmara termina aqui, mas se você quiser entrar em contato com a gente, é só mandar um e-mail para tvcamara@camarapoa.rs.gov.br. Obrigada e até a próxima edição.